I have a diplomatic answer, which is, well, I have two kinds of answers. The first one is that it depends on how you talk about write-off. If you say a default, let's talk about the real thing. Your question is whether Portugal will default on its debt. And I think what happened in Greece is a default. I know it's not called that way, but it's a default. When you restructure your debt, when you abandon the value of your debt, to me it's a default. So now, I think there is a big difference. When you look at the history of emerging markets and the emerging markets that defaulted and the ones who did not default, you have a big difference. You have a big difference between, on the one hand, Turkey and Brazil, and on the other hand, Russia and Argentina. And this big difference doesn't come from the equation I talked about. Because, of course, the debt sustainability you can talk it with an equation and say, okay, if you have this kind of interest rates, if you have this kind of primary balance, if you have this kinds of growth, you go there and you go there, and it's too much or it's okay. Of course, there is this dimension, but there is always another dimension, which is an institutional one. Is that when you look at Russia, for example, the big problem of Russia was that the government was not raising any taxes. And of course, it rings a bell with the country. You know, the big problem with Russia in 1998 is that there was no government. It's typical fiscal bargaining. No one was paying no one. There was an authority, a government authority that was able to say, guys, you have to do that and you do that. And of course, Greece is like this. Greece, you have a problem, a very deep problem of how far the government is able to make discipline among taxpayers, among people to do things. And when you have that, country default. You have that. Because whatever you do, whatever the equation you have, if you don't, and the equation for Russia was much more favorable than the one for Greece, whatever you do, there will come a day where, anyway, if you don't solve the question of the government, the question of state, the question of strength of institution, you default. So this is why. This is why I think that Spain or Portugal are very different from Greece. You know, in Portugal, you have a government that's raising tax, that is strong, and that is praised by the IMF about its possibility. So it's clear that the ability of Portugal to implement the fiscal targets are very strong. And by the way, it's already there in the IMF reviews. I'm not inventing anything. So I'm not worried about that. But the problem is that, and that's what I was saying, is that, so this is why it's very different. You will not have the kind of inevitable default that Greece would have, and this is why, to me, it was clear that Greece would go to default. I think that the question is it's more a question for Portugal. So I made a bet with a Portuguese journalist 2 years ago. I don't think I don't see her there, and I said, I think that there's going to be a debt restructuring of Portugal. And she said, no, I'm sure of not. So for the moment, she won her bet because it's not there. The problem, and this is why I present this equation, the problem, when I made the equation, I didn't change the hypothesis of the IMF in terms of primary balance. Meaning I trust completely the fact that the Portuguese government will do exactly as the IMF plans in terms of primary balance. Where I have more doubts is about the growth issue. This is where the problem is. Because the problem is that when you look at the emerging markets that had a large debt but didn't default or could implement the very strong, they had a very strong growth. Even Brazil, which is not a very strong achiever in terms of growth, had something like 4% growth during the period. Turkey, 6.5. I'm not sure that Portugal can reach even the 3 or 2.5 that are required. That's the issue. So the question doesn't lie with the budget policy, the fiscal policy, or the conditionalities in terms of structural reforms or fiscal policy. The question lies with growth. And this is the question for Europe. You know, it's not the question for Portugal. It's also the question for French or for Italy. I'm sure that also French are able to do a tight fiscal policy. Italy is very able to do it. They've done it before. They can do a primary surplus. But the question is exactly the same as Portugal, is growth. Are we able to grow at 3%? That's my question. So this is true for all of us. So I think the write-off, as you put it, the restructuring can be avoided can be avoided. So I think because there are other solutions, which are, I said, market-unfriendly solution, meaning that you stuff your banks with debt. Okay, that's not. It has some bad effects. You have to recognize it, because the problem is that if banks are stuffed with bonds, they do not grant credit to corporates, to the private sector. So that's the problem. It is called the eviction effect, crowding out effect in English. And it's typical of India. In India, the banks have been not willing to grant credit to the corporate because they are living with their public debt and they are very happy with it and they don't do anything else. So this is the problem that I see, and again, a growth problem. So this is why the question is open. I think there is a chance that it doesn't happen, but I think we have to prepare for the scenario. And I'm not sure it's, I'm going to say something absolutely horrible, because I don't know if there are bankers here, they're going to kill me, but it's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world. It's like the stupid story, the stupid things we say about Greece and the Eurozone. If Greece goes out of the Eurozone, it's the end of the Eurozone. No, it's not, Not any debt restructuring or devaluation is the end of the world for any country. Of course, it's a bad moment to spend. It has a lot of costs, but sometimes it may be unavoidable. So I think we have to be prepared to the scenario. I'm not saying it's going to be happening in Portugal. And I would say there is another issue that worries me, but it's not Portugal, it's Spain. The problem is not a public finance problem, it's a banking problem. We know that banking reforms are very costly in Spain, for example, and I'm not sure that Spain will not need a package, not for the sovereign, but a package for the banks. Because either you cure your banks with your sovereign, but then you kill your sovereign, either you find external debt you find external help for the banks. So again, the scenario of an external package for Spain for banks, to me, is also a possibility. So I think there are other events to happen in the Eurozone. Thanks God they are economists. So.
Mais alguma questão? Bom, eu colocava I want to have a question. If until in the history of the IMF never lost money helping countries. Do you think that the financing that is provided to Portugal is in risk in the case that there is a default for the first time in the history?
No. I mean, no. Why there is no default from the IMF? Because when there is a problem of possibility of default to the IMF lends money for the country to pay the IMF. So that's why it doesn't happen. But no. That's really the question. Is not the IMF money. The question is the bonds, the public bonds of the sovereign bonds of Portugal, like the problem of Greece. So I think the question is not the IMF. The IMF money is not. The question of the IMF it doesn't. The problem of the IMF, it doesn't go with the money. The money doesn't mean anything in a way. It's just the money is there to reassure, to make confidence, and the money is there also to watch, to be a sort of bargain between the conditionality but it's not the money by itself that pays the debt. It's not that. So eventually, because one day Portugal is supposed to go back on the market, whether it will be possible in the due date. Because I think that Portugal has a big, in 2013, I think September 2013, if I'm not wrong, Portugal government has a big amortization to do, I think. If I'm not wrong, I read it recently. So yes, the problem doesn't lie with the IMF. The problem is like what's going to be with the stock of sovereign debt. Of sovereign debt, whoever owns it.
Well, thank you very much. Bom, resta-me agradecer muito aos oradores que aqui tivemos, as reflexões que partilharam connosco, e destacava a qualidade das suas intervenções. Agradecer também muito a vossa presença, agradecer também à Coface pelo convite para aqui estar, e